Welcome to tonight's seminar, the Kathryn Knowles Women in International Affairs Lecture. How fit is Europe for a new transatlantic relationship? We created the seminar tonight to honor Kathryn, a beloved colleague and SAIS alumna who passed away in 2018 after a brief illness with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. KK, as we called her, loved working with students and excelled at it in her role as Associate Director of the European and Eurasian Studies program, leading study trips, helping students with their course selection, or coaching them to secure top internships. She challenged students to dream big and took great satisfaction in seeing them accomplish their goals. In her role as Director of Public Affairs, she also worked tirelessly to promote SAIS Europe as a premier destination for the study of international relations. A permanent fund to finance students' internships, as well as this lecture dedicated to accomplished women professionals in international affairs, seem like ideal initiatives to remember KK. Before I pass the floor over to Professor Eric Jones, I'd like to particularly welcome some of you in the audience personally. I can't see you, but I know that we have a wonderful group of students, faculty, staff, and friends tuning in this evening. And a special warm welcome to Marco Orsi, Kathryn's husband, her mother, and her father signing in from California. Also, Bolognese from her own class of 2001, a class I remember with great fondness, and beyond, alumni who work with KK at SAIS and supporters of the internship fund in her memory, as well as friends from the International Women's Forum of Bologna. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Eric Jones, who I'm delighted will be moderating this event. He and Kathryn were a formidable team working together for SAIS. They created the Bologna Institute for Policy Research, hosting tonight's seminar, and successfully managed the European and Eurasian Studies program from SAIS Europe, the only SAIS concentration to be based in Bologna, thereby helping to build bridges between Bologna and Washington, D.C. They also work closely with Daniela Schwarzer, our honored guest tonight, in her role as Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. But I'll leave it to Eric to introduce her. Eric, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. It's a great honor to be here this evening and particularly to share the podium with Daniela. Before I tell you about Daniela, I should let you know that the most important item on her CV is that since 2014, she's been a senior research professor in the European and Eurasian Studies program at SAIS. And that's a role that we asked her to fulfill, and she has brought an enormous number of benefits to our program and to our institution, both in her prior position at the German Marshall Fund, where she created internships and opportunities for students across Europe, and in her current position, a position that has just hours to go at the German Council on Foreign Relations, where she did the same and she introduced our students to a whole new universe of possibilities. So Daniela, before I introduce you, I'd like to thank you for all you've contributed. I know Kathryn was very grateful, and so am I. Now, the reason that we invited Daniela to come on is not just that she's a dear friend, but also because Daniela, I think, is ideally positioned to help us better to understand what's going on in the transatlantic relationship right now. I say that because Daniela has had this amazing career that spanned the last 2 to 3 decades. I say 2 to 3 decades. We're trying to be vague here because she's actually so young, it's almost embarrassing. And it started out when she was in Paris working for the Association for a Monetary Union for Europe, and extended through these associations that she had with the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, which is the premier German foreign policy think tank, the German Marshall Fund, and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, which is the German Council on Foreign Relations. And she's had leadership positions in all of these organizations. Along the way, she's accumulated the usual board directorships in places like Notre Europe, which is a think tank in Paris, and the European Council on Foreign Relations, which I can only assume is their Berlin office, but she's also picked up a directorship position at BNP Paribas. I think that has to do with the fact that she did her PhD originally both in Berlin and at the LSE, jointly supervised in political economy. And so I suspect that stuff that she did for the Association for a Monetary Union for Europe involved a heavy component of economics and finance. And all of that builds up to this weird position that she got earlier this year as special advisor to Josep Borrell, the European High Commissioner or High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, where she's actually responsible for Europe's role in the outside world. And so I think the most important thing for me to do after I ask you all silently, I guess, to welcome her is to get her to tell us, what is Europe doing right now as a world player, and how well positioned is it to influence events? Daniela, thank you so much for coming. It's such an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this very kind introduction, and thank you, Mike. I'm deeply honored to be with you tonight because, as Eric has said, I have personally encountered Kathryn. I have worked with her, and what you, Mike, said about her coaching students, we could tell wherever I was at the German Marshall Fund or at the German Council on Foreign Relations, because the internship programs we built were really nurtured by her engagement with students. And I can just say that all the size students that we have hosted over the years were superbly well selected for what we could offer. And also, I felt very ready for this kind of challenge, to come to Berlin, to get into a new organization which they don't know, and for a limited period of time be part of it. Some of them didn't speak German, and it worked out very well every single time. So I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to have happened, and I know, at least for the German Council on Foreign Relations, there is a very strong commitment to continue this. And of course, personally, I'm touched that you have selected me for this lecture, and I'll try and give my best, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the students may have. And I dare say, as this is a Women in International Affairs lecture, if you want to ask me anything on that part, being a woman in a leadership position in international affairs or European affairs, I'm happy to answer those questions as well. Eric, your question was how, what place is Europe in at the moment? And the other day I was thinking about, about the big picture. Basically, in Europe, we have gone through 15 years of crisis, if you take, or almost in 2022, it would be since the financial crisis broke in the US in 2007 and then spilled into Europe in 2008. This is almost a decade and a half that Europe has been occupied with crisis management. And if you look at the sequence of crises, it is very interesting to see how, when we start with the financial sovereign debt, banking crisis, the economic crisis that came along with it, then we move on a few years, we see the migration, first we see the annexation of Crimea. So really a shock to Europe, because its whole approach towards neighbor policy was suddenly questioned, and the European security order was challenged by Russia. And what had to happen was, of course, a complete revision of the picture and strategy that we have, or it hasn't entirely happened, but it should have happened in my view. Then the migration crisis, then Brexit, and now COVID. So where are we now? I think the interesting thing is you can really tell two stories about those crises. The one story is the more negative one. You can say that those crises have deepened the tensions within the European Union. They have deepened economic and social divergence, both within countries, but also between countries. They have brought up tensions between North and South and East and West, which I really don't want to caricature, but which were amplified, which were there always, but which different perspectives, for instance, on sovereignty, on homogeneity of societies, on what liberal democracy or just democracy might mean. So if I had to describe Europe now, I could easily give you a very grim picture of political polarization, radicalization, socioeconomic tensions, and lots of forces that drive Europe apart. But then there's also this other story which I want to tell, and that is the story of a European Union which, in particular, external observers said was almost dead several times throughout those crises. And I remember working for the German Marshall Fund, first being in the US for a year as a fellow at Harvard University, then moving to GMF. And I had so many discussions with American colleagues who didn't know the internal workings of the EU that well. And Eric, of course, I exclude you from that. But the number of times that I heard that the euro was about to fail was quite impressive. And so I think the story that I also want to share is this ability of the system to, yes, move to the brink, but eventually pull back, because the euro was on the brink, in particular in the year 2010, but also in the following years, because it seemed that markets had lost trust. There was a moment in time where French bonds were no longer traded in New York. And that is, of course, the deepest loss of trust you can live through. But what Europe managed to do was essentially to manage the crisis and build better institutions and better governance mechanisms at the same time. And if we look at the various crises that I have mentioned, I think for each and every one of them, you can also tell that story of Europe coming out stronger. But I don't want to leave it there. I want to say that today, if we look at Europe's role in the world, we have a system that is under deep tensions. And why is this so important with regards to external relations? Because we by now have external forces intervening within the European Union. Russia is one of them. China is another. We can name more, and maybe we find more throughout the evening. And they, of course, play with the fragilities that I have just outlined. The COVID crisis, in my view, is a particular challenge, and I will stop there. Why? Because it has led to a situation where we see, or we have seen, borders being pulled up again, countries not living even the slightest solidarity in the spring of 2020, and Italy was particularly touched and early touched by the COVID crisis. And it took far too long until Europeans realized we can't just look away, pull up our borders, stop exports of medical goods. No, we have to act very differently. So once again, the system proved to be able to self-correct, as it did with the setting up of the Recovery Fund, which is a huge new instrument, which makes use of all the tools that the EU treaties provide and actually mobilized large sums of money. But still, in this new world, which is a world of great power competition, systemic competition, more geo-economic world, I would say as a bottom line, Europe is not yet prepared to tackle all those international challenges in the world. And we really have to work on consolidating internally to be able to act more forcefully externally.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it, but I guess I worry a bit that Europe doesn't really have the luxury of time to prepare. I mean, if you were to take those two stories that you just told, couldn't we use the same two stories to frame the last 15 years of history in the United States? I mean, there's certainly something very positive going on in the United States right now, but it seems as though we've gone through some very challenging episodes as well. What is the United States like as a partner, and how much can the European Union take for granted that the United States is going to keep order in the world around it?
So the good news is, of course, that Biden is now the US president who has shown a credible and very firm commitment to the world order as we like it in the West. Rules-based institutions, international law, strong emphasis on human rights, dedication to international, multilateral, but also intergovernmental cooperation. So best news for Europe. However, the learnings from 4 years of Trump is how fragile both the international system is, how quickly an ally can turn into a challenger, into someone who calls us, I can't remember the word, I think it was a foe that he used, for Europeans in any ways. He saw us as competitors on many, many things. And the pressure that Europe experienced during those years was extremely high. And now looking forward, can Europe rely on the United States? And what do we see in the United States? Of course, this is the moment to rebuild transatlantic relations, very clearly so. However, Europeans have to be very realistic that what we saw in particular in winter 2020 and until January when Biden finally came into office is the fragility of the US democracy. And of course, this current US president has most of all has to worry about that and has to rebuild a solid democracy within his own country. And the initiatives he has taken, in particular his speech yesterday, show this huge ambition he has. So for Europeans, it will be crucial to watch very closely how this will evolve over the next month and then years. We shouldn't have illusions that after the midterm elections, the situation may be more difficult for transatlantic cooperation. And right now, Europe is challenged by the fact that there are some in Europe who really want to embrace the US and go back to, it almost seems, to former times pre-Trump. But then there are others who are far more cautious and who say, okay, we have a window of opportunity now, but we have to build our own strategic autonomy, as some say, others say European sovereignty. And it's very interesting to compare how the concepts that governments have diverge. And much of that is really the assumption they have on the reliability of the transatlantic relationship going forward.
So I think that's, a really important insight, because it appears to me you referred earlier to actors that were exploiting the divisions within Europe. And certainly the Trump administration, at least in its first 2 years, would fall in that camp as well, and perhaps even Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. But in a Biden administration, you can assume at least that the United States is not going to try to divide Europe. On the other hand, it appears to me that other actors are not so generous. So, for example, if we were to look at this most recent scandal with Turkey, or the debate that we have over Nord Stream 2 with Russia, do you think that the United States is going to help build a common West, as you called it, or is it really these actors are going to succeed in exploiting divisions within Europe and preventing any serious alliance with the United States from re-emerging?
I think it's really up to Europeans. So I wouldn't, if in the end we don't manage to build a strong transatlantic alliance, I wouldn't blame it on those external forces. Of course, they intervene and they act extremely strategically, but it would be sort of giving up self-responsibility, saying their fault, we didn't manage. Europe has to manage those forces, and Europe has to be very clear what it has to lose if it doesn't seize this transatlantic momentum. I found it really interesting to see the initial reactions to Biden's election. And you said he is not going to divide the European Union like Trump really tried to do. I agree. He won't deliberately try to alienate Europeans among each other, but he will act. And some of his actions will provoke very different reactions from the European partners. So for instance, quick moves on climate. Europe is not, although we have the Green New Deal, is not entirely aligned among member states how quick the transition should happen and how much financial compensation there should be. And the more and more of the core topics that Europe has to grapple with are dealt with in a transatlantic alliance, and they should be, the more dynamics will develop and the more difficult it will be to keep those diverging views within the European Union together. And I guess the most divisive issue here will be the relationship with China.
Now, the relationship with China, I agree with you, is going to be unbelievably divisive. I guess my question on the China relationship is, given that we can all see this being such a challenge, why was Europe so eager to move forward with the comprehensive agreement on investment in the waning days of the Trump administration? And what does Europe hope to achieve now that it seems that that agreement hasn't really given them the purchase that they had wanted in building some new, I don't know, Sino-European entente?
Well, let's start with a story that was told by the German EU presidency. First point, this wasn't something that the German EU presidency rushed through, but this had been on the agenda for years. There was progress in the negotiations, and eventually, because of the election of Joe Biden, the Chinese became more cooperative, and they also wanted to close the deal because they could no longer, rely that there's no close transatlantic alliance, and there was more willingness to compromise. I would answer all true, very probably, but it is still a political decision to close the deal around Christmas, while you know that not even a month later, the new US president comes into office. And also, why would Europe assume that its negotiation leverage, its negotiation power would have reduced after he came into office? I don't really buy that. So I do believe it had to do with the agenda of the German EU presidency and really the ambition, because every country, every government wants to close certain deals. And the relationship with China was always one of the big priorities of the German EU presidency in several dimensions. One was this deal. The other one was the all EU 27 China summit, which eventually couldn't take place because of COVID. But the idea there was to bring the whole EU together, all leaders from the 27 countries, together with the Chinese leadership, because China tries to divide the EU countries among each other by using formats like the 17+1 or the Belt and Road Initiative, where they select countries out of the group of 27 and build special ties, offer special access, define common projects, and so on. Now we can, I guess, say that after the closing of the investment agreement, first of all, immediate reaction by the European Parliament. Not sure we're going to ratify because the clauses on human rights in particular weren't seen as strong enough. Since then, the situation with China has deteriorated a lot. Sanctions, counter-sanctions, a banning of several policymakers from the European Parliament, academics, and others from traveling to China and from working with Chinese partners, which for some is really a problem. And I think the realism about China is even deeper on what the regime wants, how they implement very toughly the whole, well, basically all of the strategic goals that the Chinese leadership has defined very, very transparently over the past years. Essentially, we can easily map the goals China has until 2049. Right? So we know pretty well in even more detailed areas like AI or others, where the Chinese leadership wants to take the country. Europe does play a role in that, but in my view, not to our benefit, although we heavily rely on trade and investment with China. So to sum up the problem that Europe has with China, first of all, and in the transatlantic relationship, the strong, I would say, approach that I hear coming out of DC, and I'd love to be corrected if that's a misreading, is the goal is to stop the rise of China, to contain China, and to prevent the US from losing this world leader position. Not only because of the balance of power between the two countries, but also because of the impact that this would have on the shaping of global order and the principles underlying structures of global order. And I don't think many leaders in Europe would formulate it quite the same way. So this idea of a rising power and a declining power, getting into a fierce conflict, maybe even more, this, Europeans see it as a possibility, but it's not felt with that same sense of urgency. Very realistically speaking, Europe depends far more on China economically than the US does. And that's why it's so difficult for Europeans to easily side with the US in this very strong position on China. So I guess this is the way forward, because you asked for that as well, is with all realism that we have to have, first of all, about Chinese goals in the world, but then also about the situation within China when it comes to human rights, when it comes to technology-based authoritarianism. Europeans will want to mediate in this conflict, and I hope not give in on principles, but make sure that there is no abrupt ending of the close economic and financial relationships that exist. So there's a lot of dependency at play. And I frankly think one of the major challenges, and now coming to Germany because I speak from Berlin, and Germany has always played a key role in shaping Europe's relationships with China, it is really over the medium term rethinking our own economic model. So we are less vulnerable and we are more able to actually use the scope we can use for foreign and security policy more freely. And that brings me back to that idea of strategic autonomy, which essentially means you should be able to decide where you want to go and not feel that either the US or China rather make it impossible for you to move ahead with what you think is a priority.
I think from a US perspective, the argument that you make is compelling in the sense that we do share common values across the Atlantic to an intensity that we don't share common values with other parts of the globe. But it becomes less compelling when we look at the build out of infrastructure, because when you talk about dependence, Belt and Road is designed only to increase that dependence and to increase it structurally. And when we look at the structural dependence that the European economy has for manufactured products from China, but also for energy from Russia, the two sides of the coin don't seem to work together hand in hand. It seems to be that the structural dependence increases and the willingness to push back diminishes. And here I think the Russia story might be more interesting and important from an American perspective because of the way the Biden administration has tried to soft play American opposition in Nord Stream 2, but we're confronted with divisions also in the US Congress. It's almost impossible for the Biden administration to run a steady line on Nord Stream 2 when the Senate has so many voices that would like to see a much harder action against an increase in Europe's structural independence and Germany's structural dependence on what we see as a strategic competitor. So I guess, how can Europe continue to make that balance, having these physical structural relationships with these strategic competitors like China and Russia, and yet standing on principle on issues like human rights?
Well, it's getting more and more difficult, and the more assertive China is and the more strength it has, the more difficult this is getting. So I think the first thing to do for Europe is really to think through how can we reduce those dependencies. And that's what I meant when I said Germany has to rethink its own economic model, because essentially we are very dependent on many things and many players out there. And this was really built up in times where no one thought this could turn against us or turn around. So I think this is a key task. And in that reflection, of course, the EU and the single market gain ever more importance, really, to find a way out of those dependencies with actors that don't share our shared value base. And the other thing is really to build broader alliances. And that's really where I feel the Biden administration is going with a number of initiatives. And luckily, the thinking has also started in Europe, particularly on the Indo-Pacific. So for Germany, this was really for years, more or less a blank. And of course, there were diplomatic ties and everything, but there was no strategy about the Indo-Pacific region. And last year, the government issued Indo-Pacific guidelines, the first document of its kind for Germany. And what's interesting about it is really the fact that it is an all-government document, so it's not a foreign affairs thing, but really includes security, defense, foreign policy, economics, and so on. And it reaches out both to Paris, explicitly in the document, and to Brussels, saying we want to make this issue a dialogue between France and Germany, and we also want to take our initiative to Brussels and help the EU devise an Indo-Pacific strategy. Of course, other European players have a very different presence in the Indo-Pacific. France, for instance, also the UK, which in my view, Brexit or not, has to be part of the strategic reflection. And now Biden has already used, for instance, the Quad as one forum where he has built ties with actors in the region, and has clearly shown that the US thinks, yes, transatlantic, but far more broadly in terms of bringing like-minded countries together. And one of the basis of this like-minded is basically Western-style democracy, although it takes different forms, maybe in some Asian countries. But this general assumption that allies of the US, who in previous years were more seen maybe from a security and defense perspective, are now part of a much broader conversation. And Europe is only getting ready for this now. Again, quite late, but I would say the move that Europe takes is into the right direction. But we need to be faster. You said that earlier. Can we actually afford to be so slow? No, not really, because others are extremely fast in the actions they take.
You said things that actually raise another conundrum that we encountered already in the Obama administration, and that seems to be coming up again. I agree with you completely that there's the possibility for the United States and Europe to work together in a broader alliance based on shared political values. There's also the possibility for the United States and Europe to work together on the basis of shared economic values, the industrial model that you talked about before. But what we experienced during the TTIP negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that took place in the waning years of the Obama administration, is that our shared political values and our shared economic values did not go hand in hand, because there was this surprising political reaction to the creation of more homogeneous, more like-minded supply chains across the Atlantic. So how do we reconcile that fundamental tension?
I think this is really, that was a wake-up call, also for Germany, because no one would expect that trade would become such an important issue that people would go to the streets to demonstrate against a transatlantic trade agreement. If you had said that to anyone 10 years earlier, they would all have said, no, A, no one cares, and B, they think it's a good thing if they know it's happening. So suddenly people cared, and they didn't think it was a good thing when it happened. What I take away from those months where we actually really did have protests on the street against TTIP is a sober analysis on where our societies are on globalization. Also, if we just look at transatlantic relations, even during Obama years, damage had been done to the trust base that should exist if you go into such an encompassing deal with each other. And here, one of the big scars that Europe, and particularly Germany, took away from the Obama years was the phone tapping experience. And I personally, during those months, tried to understand how can it be that, of course, I mean, the Germans answered in a legal way, right? They wanted to get inside. They had a delegation of MPs traveling to DC and wanted to have a legal procedure to clarify what happened and then to find a legal agreement that this is not going to happen again. And of course, this didn't happen because the Americans had no interest to sign that kind of deal and be transparent on what they did. Now, what this showed to me was the difference between European countries on what it means if an ally spies on you. The French, they said, this is not acceptable. There was a little eruption, some strong political comments, and then it was over. The Germans were emotional. for a very long time. And why? Because in our history, the US presents so much more than just an ally. So many people were personally disappointed. They thought this was a huge breach of trust and this shouldn't happen. And this, I think, is a question of political maturity. On the one hand, the pendulum kind of swung to the side of distrust, and it's slowly moving back. And Trump, of course, greatly accelerated this move. But now we have to simply be very realistic, and we have to look at, on the one hand, the value space, on the other hand, the strong interests we share. And then there are contentious points. Of course, we have differences between Americans and Europeans, and they have to be put onto the table. But the point here, just as for the European Union, is if we don't manage better cooperation between actually more or less like-minded groups of countries, and we decide not to put our best efforts into reconciling those conflicting interests because we are able to see the longer term and broader goal that we want to achieve, then we find ourselves pretty alone in a world where I wouldn't even argue it's a good choice for the largest European economy, Germany, to try and go anything alone.
Now I think you raised an important point about the values that we share and the interests that we share, but I'm beginning to wonder how much we share those values and interests. On the negative side, obviously, we could look at the events in the United States around January the 6th and in the unwillingness of Congress to move forward with kind of a commission on that as evidence that maybe there is a fundamental disagreement on the nature of democracy in the United States. Certainly, there's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of democracy within the European Union, which makes it hard for us to imagine that there would be a fundamental agreement across the Atlantic. Equally, if you listen to Biden's speech last night, Biden made the very strong point that we're going to build jobs because we're going to buy American. And the idea that public procurement should be restricted to a particular place is very different from the way Europe sees these events. So I wonder if our interests and values really are as consonant as they used to be.
Let me take the democracy piece first. Of course, we have very different interpretations of what democracy is and should be. In the European Union, two of our countries have essentially been downgraded in all the indexes, like Poland and Hungary, and others risk losing their place. And this is a failure, frankly, of the European Union, that it didn't manage to stop these developments, because after all, every single EU country signed on a set of principles, including rule of law and democracy, when it joined the European Union. But I think, the divisions run through the US just like they run through Europe. And maybe it is really a subject for a very intense transatlantic conversation among those who wish to do what is necessary to maintain liberal democracies on both continents. And I don't think we can ignore what happens in the US. The US shouldn't ignore what happens in Europe, and we should keep reminding each other, but also explore, first of all, what led us to this point? What are the grievances within society? Where does this potential for violence and radicalization come from? But we should also look ahead and ask ourselves together, really, what are the key challenges to liberal democracy going forward? And in particular, what role does this technological and digital revolution play in this? And, I think none of the partners at this point has answers, but the simple, it is not as simple as it used to be, that we said stable, like-minded democracies, okay, they go ahead and they project those values into the world. No, we have internal struggles. But at the moment, at least in the US, in most EU countries, we have political leaderships who do subscribe to those values. But that means we still can't deny the fact that they are contested within the US and within Europe. Yes, and on the question of interests, yes, of course there are conflicting interests. of course, Biden is not Trump, but what he also has to worry about are those people who feel disconnected, disadvantaged. That idea of conducting foreign policy for the middle classes is something that European leaders are really, really looking into. And they want to see what he will do and try to learn from this, because also in our European context, it is very hard nowadays to justify strong international engagement, to explain why we should put more money into defense, into development aid, into humanitarian aid. People feel under threat at home, and the COVID crisis has certainly made this more difficult. However, as a foreign policy think tanker, I think there is a huge political task to explain to the constituencies in all countries how important it is to engage internationally, because the biggest risks that we are facing these days, they are not really made at home, but they are transnational in nature, and require multilateral answers in many, many ways: climate, health, tech regulation. So yes, I mean, it's a very contested field, but I do think there are very strong arguments both for transatlantic cooperation and more international engagement.
I want to bring the audience in for questions and would invite members of the audience to put their questions into the Q&A box. I'll read the questions out to you, but I'll identify the speakers along the way. While they're formulating some other things to ask, I just want to pick up on that last point you made. I mean, if there's a transnational interest we have, it's to avoid base erosion and profit shifting, taking money out of our tax systems and hiding it off in these sort of enclaves. And equally, it's to find a way to regulate digital commerce. But it seems as though these are both areas that need a multilateral solution and where we can't get effective transatlantic cooperation. Do you see that kind of cooperation forthcoming in the new Biden administration and European environment?
Very hard. I mean, I hope for this to happen. But even Europeans are divided among each other with regards to tax policy. And it will require a lot of political investment to move those countries who don't want taxation, for instance, on the tech giants, or minimum taxes, as Biden has suggested. Some EU countries simply do not want that to happen. However, if we don't do it, again, the price is very high, and the question is, how long can countries afford this competitive downward race, which is happening and which is a problem within Europe and the single market? And here we touch upon a question of solidarity, really. And we have lived through this debate over the past years, because those countries that basically have a higher tax rate and were asked to step in when some countries needed help as a consequence of the sovereign debt and banking crisis, they said, well, you should look into your own tax systems. We don't see why we should use our taxpayers' money if you try to be a country where tax levels are very low and you ask for our solidarity. So it's very interesting to see how this whole solidarity debate has developed throughout the crisis. And I do think that it will be a topic which will be very, very present on the European agenda. It used to be a debate, the solidarity debate, more or less a north-south debate. And what we increasingly see is that it's becoming an east-south debate. And it's one of the big dividing lines that I foresee for the next few years in the EU.
Now, you mentioned something in the context of tax that I thought was really interesting, because the European Union has always pursued tax through a rules-based system to the greatest extent to which it can, not prescribing certain things. But yes, there are certain areas of tax that are rules-based. We have a great question from Verena Ringler that asks whether the EU might be able to leverage the Biden administration's interest in addressing climate change to try to push that kind of a rule-based framework up to the global level, so that we could export Europe's model for governance within Europe to make something much more binding, much more effective in addressing climate concerns across the globe. Do you think that the European Union is in a position to do that?
It definitely is. Would love to see this happen. Whether the European Union can leverage their weight in those global climate negotiations that have to go on still remains to be seen. It's really, at the moment, I think one of the most pressing issues to enable the European Union to not only implement the Green New Deal internally, but to leverage its own power and to find out ways how it can actually be a very effective global player on climate change. It would be fantastic if there was agreement on across the Atlantic on the mechanisms and the functioning of future global instruments. However, we shouldn't forget that the other key player in this that we definitely need to get on board is China. And although China has committed in a surprising way for many to reach ambitious climate goals in not too long a time, the question of is, to my sense, unanswered. And I'm not that deep into China. Someone else may know who's part of this discussion, so please chime in. Whether the Chinese would actually be ready to accept such a framework. And definitely this is the buy-in our world needs because of the importance that China has in the fight against climate change.
This point you're making, I think, is hugely important. In the original European security strategy written by Robert Cooper, the emphasis was on effective multilateralism. And that emphasis on effective multilateralism has been diluted somewhat in the global strategy document that came out with Federica Mogherini. And I guess my question is Europe actually moderating its ambitions to achieve this kind of a rule-based system at the global order? Is it becoming more pragmatic in that sense? Because you certainly used the term pragmatism in talking about China beforehand.
I think it has to. Well, what we see, if we just take the issue of trade, right, is over the past years a decline of the World Trade Organization. So something that Europe really liked and liked to play within as a framework for global trade has to be reformed and reestablished. So that's already one task where I think Europe is more realistic and sees the situation as it is. This is going to be a struggle to reform an existing institution. Whether building new institutions is possible based on the fundamental assumptions that the EU would bring to the table on rules-based behavior, binding goals, sanction mechanisms, maybe something that Europe tends to like. Yeah, I think the political will would be there, but I'm not sure there is at this moment in time the political leverage to impose this kind of thinking about multilateral institutions on others who want to live by political commitments without big sanctioning mechanisms and so on. So I think this is a real struggle. However, I think the only chance we have at all is if the US and the Europeans work together on this with other key players in the world, and countries that come to mind, could be Australia, could be Japan or others. So to be seen.
I mean, the flip side of that notion of pragmatism and is that the European Union does have to be willing to assert itself. It has to be willing to project its interests, both through sanctions, which we've mentioned repeatedly, and maybe through something more muscular. And here I'm thinking really about the Donbass region in Ukraine. I have a question from Anastasios Theophanakis about whether Russia might be the agent that provokes the creation of some kind of real, meaningful, maybe more muscular European strategic autonomy. Would you expect that to be a possible reaction, or would Europe rather retreat and let the United States play the leading role with NATO and pushing back against any potential Russian aggression?
I don't think that, first of all, the EU wouldn't be able to push back militarily against Russia. So it would have to be NATO, or it would have to be single EU countries to do this. there's no appetite whatsoever to get involved into a military conflict. There is a big concern, of course, that, and that was more present during the Trump years, but it still is present now, that would Europe actually be ready to act in a scenario where there is an even stronger Russian provocation? I would say there are enough right now anyway, but an even stronger one, and the buildup of troops on the eastern border of Ukraine over the past weeks, which then diminished again. That was a moment where, of course, thinking has to start. What happens if there are military movements into eastern Ukraine? What happens if we face a situation of a simultaneous attack of Russia in eastern Ukraine and maybe China on Taiwan, to name a possible scenario, which I don't say is close, but we need to have that kind of thinking as Europeans. Where would the US attention go? And how would we then solve that situation ourselves? And, I can't give you a clear answer. I mean, I would have a very clear thought what should happen and how Europe should go about its eastern neighborhood. But whether European leaders would be ready, at least some would, but I don't think a majority of countries would actually want to get involved militarily in Europe's east.
The other issue of perennial concern in the context of European foreign policy is the persistent threat of unrestricted migration. And that seems to have been addressed by the deals that were made both in Turkey and in Libya, but those deals seem always to be quite precarious. Is this a problem that Europe is reconciled to having to address on its own? Because it doesn't seem like this is something where any transatlantic solution would be made readily available.
I believe this is really something that Europe has to work on and deal with. We have several questions, or so many questions, with regard to the migration challenge going forward. But just to stay with the example that you have mentioned, with the deals with Turkey and Libya, of course, a deal is a give and take, but Europe has to reflect to what extent it becomes the influence of players within Europe or on single European countries become too important. And here the question of Turkey, of course, is of particular importance, because with Turkey, there are so many issues to be dealt with on the agenda. And again, speaking from Berlin, Germany is a country which is always very cautious with Turkey. It has this close ties, of course, due to the population of Turkish origin in Germany, and historically close ties. And it can possibly leverage this relationship in some instances. But the EU as such is quite divided over the question how to deal with Turkey. And so I think it is more a European task than a transatlantic task. Of course, if the US decided to moderate, to side with the Europeans on some issues where we have trouble with Turkey, that would be helpful. But essentially, I don't think the US attention will be focused on solving Europe's migration problems.
The other part of Europe's sort of unique foreign policy, I think, has to be the relationship with the United Kingdom. There's this special relationship that obviously exists between Britain and the United States, insofar as such relationships exist with individual countries. But the relationship between the European Union and Britain seems particularly fraught at the moment. And I guess my question would be, to what extent has Brexit actually put a permanent constraint on the development of Europe as a serious global actor? Or to what extent do you think that'll be overcome once the teething pains have been addressed?
Well, again, two stories to tell. One is that the UK was among those countries who, over the decades, really prevented Europe to forge a stronger foreign policy defense identity, because integration was simply not possible with the UK as an EU member. It is not without coincidence that the move on PESCO, so the European Structured Defence Cooperation, happened once the decision on Brexit was taken. And it was also a reaction, of course, to the Trump administration and the fear among Europeans that Trump could actually question or weaken NATO. Now, the other part of the story is, of course, Europe has lost a nuclear power. It's third country in terms of population and economic strength, member of the UN Security Council. So if you ask for Europe's clout in the world with or without the UK, it's obvious that with the UK, the EU is a far stronger player. So the challenge now is really to overcome these current tensions that are there, that are out there in the press almost every day, but then also behind closed doors over some parts of the deal, despite the exit agreement that was eventually signed, that still need to be settled. And I think Europe is so well advised, or the EU, because the UK is part of Europe, to really look at its own role in the world, both through an EU lens, but then also a European lens. Because otherwise, you know, we are simply talking about an entity which has just lost an important international player. And just one final thought on what's happening in the UK since Brexit has been completed. I think it's very interesting to see how Boris Johnson and his government put out strategic, or share their strategic thinking for global Britain, which was belittled by many in the EU as a completely illusionary, naive idea when the whole Brexit campaign was going on. But now, interestingly, Johnson somewhat manages to show a global ambition of the UK, and we will see more of that. Now it's the G7 presidency, there will be the COP26 in Glasgow later this year. So he will use the world stage, even at home. And what he is developing is some kind of vision of a UK role in the world that actually offers interesting touch points for Europe on some of the key challenges we are facing. But at the same time, part of the narrative is, of course, that now the UK is free because of having exited the EU. So that's not easy to digest for the EU leaders. But I do think we should watch very closely how this narrative is being developed in the UK. Because he also had to deal with a backlash against migration, against globalization, a kind of nationalization of the debate. And maybe he finds a way out of this, which Europeans can actually learn from.
Now, we've talked about the change in what's going on in the UK. We should obviously speak about the change that's underway in Germany. We have very significant transfer of power within the Christian Democrats, but we also have the rise of the Greens. And Scott McCallum has a question about what would happen if the Greens were to form or join the next coalition government. How would that change both German policy toward Europe and Europe's policy toward the outside world?
So the Greens are a bit of a surprise package in the sense of the party leadership is very clear. They have rather clear party program and election platform. However, when you look at the parliamentary group, if it doubles in size or even grows more strongly than that, there will be a lot of members of parliament who are less well known and who may have more fundamental positions on defense, on security matters, on external relations, than the current Green leadership and the current parliamentary group has. So the Greens come from a very strong peace movement tradition and have been very critical of NATO and of other things that from today's perspective, it would be a problem if a German government wouldn't back. So I believe one conclusion from this is that within the government and the parliament, the role of the president of the parliamentary group will be extremely important to basically forge one joint group here of many, many newcomers to Berlin politics. Now, where could we see different approaches than the current government? I believe the Greens would take a tougher line on China and on Russia, but within the constraints that we have just discussed, they also have to worry about the German growth model and employment within our country in a moment where the German industry is on a big threat anyway because of the transition of the automobile industry and others. So they would face those constraints, but they would have, I think, a line that in this current government only parts of the Christian Democrats and parts of the SPD defend, but not necessarily the Chancellor at the moment. On defense, I don't think they would question NATO. Again, it depends also on the coalition, of course, but speaking of maybe a conservative green coalition, which is one possibility, I think they would align on NATO. However, with a strong inner party debate on nuclear. So that's something that the party leadership would have to deal with. On transatlantic ties, I think they understand that this is a huge opportunity now to work with the US, in particular on climate. And maybe last point on trade, there would be a strong ambition that the Greens would push through the government within the EU when the European Commission is mandated to negotiate trade deals, that the climate and the human rights component is sufficiently recognized.
Now, Daniela, I know your time with us is limited, so I want to ask you, if I may, just a couple of personal questions. One personal question would be, if you were advising students right now who were interested in a career in foreign policy, what would be your 3 best tips? What should they think about doing? Should it be they've got to go into a think tank? Should it be they've got to get quantitative skills? Should it be they've got to network aggressively? What do you think are the things that they should prioritize at this particular moment?
So if foreign policy career means going into government, I think you have to be very, very aware of how the system where you want to be a policymaker or a diplomat or whatever, how that system works, because there are huge differences. So for instance, in Germany, the revolving door idea that leading think tankers move into government, very, very rare. I mean, I don't really know examples. While in the US, if you look at who has now moved into the Biden administration, I would say all my think tank friends are gone because they are all working the State Department, the MOD, or wherever, on the White House even. So this really depends on where you're from, and you should look at the way, the way staff is actually recruited. My best advice for Germany would be start as a very young diplomat and work your way up. Then potentially you get an important role. And think tanking is superbly interesting, but not in every country you get an access to the public sector. In terms of skills, I would advise to learn languages and to really familiarize yourself at least with one other country. So I see, in my case, this is definitely France. That is the country I know best. And it serves as a base, of course, for many things that I am able to perceive happening in Europe. Of course, I shouldn't be limited to that Franco-German lens, but it helps if you at least see one system, which is so fundamentally different from your own, culturally, language-wise, the mechanics of decision-making, in that case, a very presidential, and in our case, a very federal system with long decision-making processes, while in France, the president rules. So, something of that kind, that you are at home in more than one particular culture and political system. I think that's what I would say was really helpful for myself to, then it's much easier to see other models and discover other things. And I don't know whether I mentioned languages, but I think languages are really key. Because, of course, you can get everywhere and anywhere with English, but I do feel that if I speak the language of a country, I do get a different understanding of where they are. And English, of course, is the instrument of choice if you can't afford the time or the effort to learn a particular country's language, but it does help so much to be able to converse in your counterpart's language, but also to listen to the media, to listen how they discuss over a glass of wine in the evening and so on. I think that's really helpful to understand others.
Now, in that context, I want to ask really the second question. You and I have talked many times over the years as you've been moving from one job to another. And I guess my question is, have you found that it has been an essential part of your career to be willing to change positions? And have you found that making those changes has been more challenging because you're a woman than it would have been if you had been a man?
First of all, I think that the changes that I made over the years really brought me to where I am today. So I worked for various, as you said, initially think tanks, research institutes, and every time I switched jobs, I had a different challenge. So in my first job, I never had to fundraise because it's fully funded from a publicly funded institute. And then with GMF, I learned, first of all, I learned to work and survive in an American organization, and I learned to love it, really. And I learned to fundraise for my own program and to build something from scratch, because no one would worry about me. I was hired as the program director, and then, it was up to me to make it fly. And without that experience, I would have never dared to accept the job to lead the German Council on Foreign Relations, because there you are essentially everything. You are the content person who sits on a panel or speaks in a TV interview. You are the quality check for the publications and the research work that is being done. You are the manager, in this case of an organization of 85 people, but a network of 3,000 members. And you are, of course, the person who worries together with colleagues in every single case, but still it all in a way occupies your mind. You have to worry about the funding of the organization. So I would say really every step brought me new learnings and new insights and encouraged me then to take the next step. And sometimes I think that my current next step, which will happen over the weekend, because it's the end of the month of April, as I joined the Open Society Foundations, which is a challenging task, had I not worked for the German Marshall Fund before, and had I had a fundamental experience of working for an American organization, I'm not sure I would have made that move. So, in such, I would say it's such an easy way that I'm not worrying about this part. But of course, there are many other challenges, and I know I will, after a few years, have learned so much which I now can't even name because I simply don't know the challenges. Now, having been a woman in all those steps, really, I never worried about that. Some younger colleagues tell me I should speak more about it, and I've learned that over the past 4 years with DGAP, that actually it's not only important to do and show what you do, but really also to speak about it, how it has been possible, what the problems are, and so on. And whenever I exchange views with other women, it is really interesting to see how we all have the little anecdotes where we can tell stories how there was discrimination, there were gender issues, and so on. But in our daily life, we tend to just push them away and think, wow, that's impolite, or that's not quite how things should work. And then we move on because we have a job to do. But it's important to reflect on those little anecdotes that happen all the time. Like when you come to a panel, you don't get the same time to speak. Or you are being asked, did you prepare your notes because you are so young, and in brackets, you're a woman. Have you ever sat on a panel? All those things, they happen, in particular in early career years. And it's really important to, in my view, to reflect upon them, to have peers with whom you can discuss these issues, but then also sometimes to address them. And I personally have stopped moderating male panels. I invite the organizers to invite another woman, then I'm willing to just moderate, or I say, okay, if you need a speaker, you can take me and get a male moderator. So I'm really working on this in a day-to-day way, and I'm in particular also encouraging my colleagues to bring up those issues. I want to say one final personal thing, and that is I'm also a mother. And in Germany, this wouldn't have been that easy to go this career path with 3 children, had I not lived in France before, because I simply got socialized into my professional life with role models who did this very naturally. So when I moved back from France, I thought this was going to be normal. And then I realized with the first child, this is not normal at all. So this is also an important thing to speak about, to discuss how hard it is. And I think the article that Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote in The Atlantic, which is a super realistic piece, what you can do and what you can't do as a professional and as a mother at the same time. I think those are debates we need to have, and not only women. I think this is this is as much a discussion for fathers as well. So yeah, we have a long way to go, but I personally wouldn't say that I have been very disadvantaged in any point of my career because I'm a woman.
Well, Daniela, I can't thank you enough for the time you've shared with us, and particularly at such a busy day, your last day on the job at the German Council on Foreign Relations. I know that KK would have enjoyed this encounter, and I certainly benefited from our conversation. So I wanna invite you to come back whenever you want, and hope you'll come back repeatedly in the future. But for now, I just want to thank you for taking the time and wish you all the best in your new endeavors.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was a huge honor for me to be invited to speak with you tonight. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, everyone, for joining us from the outside world. I know that Susanna Tilson is going to shut down the room any minute, but at a certain point, all of this will be recorded, or it has been recorded, and it will all be put up on YouTube. So if you only saw part of this episode, or if you didn't see bits that you didn't understand and want to see again, or if you want to recommend it to others, please go to our website at www.bipr.eu, and you'll find a link to the program, and that link will allow you to see it as many times as you can. All right? Take care, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And thank you so much again, Daniela.
Thanks to you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.